The marriage certificate still exists in the Georgia State Archives, carefully preserved between sheets of acid-free paper in a climate-controlled vault beneath the streets of Atlanta. The document is unremarkable in most respects: standard legal language, official seals, witness signatures, except for one detail that makes archivists uncomfortable whenever they're asked to retrieve it for researchers. The bride's name appears not as a proper name, but as a description. Blind Ruth, property of said household, cook, approximately 33 years of age, no surname recorded. What makes this 1851 document so profoundly disturbing isn't just the casual dehumanization inherent in listing a human being as property in a marriage contract, or even the grotesque nature of a union between a wealthy plantation owner and his sightless, enslaved cook. It's the fact that within 6 months of their wedding ceremony, Cornelius Ashford would be found dead in his locked bedroom, his body positioned in a way that suggested he had spent his final moments trying to claw his own eyes out. His fingernails were broken and bloody. His face was a mask of absolute terror, and his eyes, those eyes that had watched Ruth work in his kitchen for 4 years, never truly seeing her as anything more than useful property, bore chemical burns that physicians couldn't explain, as there was no chemical agent found anywhere in the sealed room. Local records from that period, carefully preserved in private family collections and historical societies throughout central Georgia, hint at a conspiracy so methodical and psychologically devastating that county investigators quietly buried the case within 2 weeks of Ashford's death. The official report concluded that he had died of apoplectic seizure brought on by nervous exhaustion and business anxieties, a diagnosis that satisfied exactly no one who had actually examined the crime scene, but which allowed everyone involved to avoid asking the questions that would have exposed uncomfortable truths about how completely a blind woman had manipulated the entire community around her. Before we continue with the story of how blind Ruth orchestrated what may be the most perfect murder in American history, a killing that required no weapon, left no evidence, and was accomplished by someone who never once saw her victim's face, make sure to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. And if you find this story as compelling as we do, hit that like button and share it with someone who appreciates dark historical mysteries that challenge everything we think we know about power, perception, and justice. Now, let me take you back to a time when blindness was considered not just a disability, but a mark of God's judgment, when enslaved people were legally classified as property rather than persons, and when a woman who couldn't see learned to perceive truths that the sighted deliberately overlooked. The events that led to that impossible wedding and Ashford's terrifying death began not in Georgia, but in Virginia, 13 years earlier, on a tobacco plantation where a 19-year-old girl with perfect vision was about to learn that sometimes the cruelest punishments create the most dangerous enemies. Ruth hadn't always been blind. She had been born Ruth Elizabeth Morrison in 1818, the daughter of an enslaved woman and a white overseer who never acknowledged his paternity. Her mother, recognizing that Ruth's lighter skin and her father's occasional guilty protection might provide opportunities for a better life, had taught her daughter to read in secret, a criminal offense that could result in brutal punishment if discovered, but which Ruth's mother considered essential for any chance at eventual freedom. Young Ruth had possessed extraordinary eyesight, the kind of keen vision that allowed her to spot birds in distant trees and read text by candlelight that others found too dim to make out. She had used this gift in her work as a kitchen assistant on the Morrison tobacco plantation in central Virginia, developing a reputation for preparing meals with meticulous attention to visual detail, garnishes arranged with artistic precision, vegetables cut to perfectly uniform sizes, presentations that impressed even the most critical dinner guests. But Ruth's visual talents had also made her valuable in ways that would ultimately prove catastrophic. By age 17, she had been trained as a personal servant to Margaret Morrison, the plantation owner's wife, a position that required her to dress her mistress, arrange her hair, and maintain her wardrobe with the kind of exacting standards that only someone with excellent eyesight could achieve. It was work that brought Ruth into daily contact with the Morrison family's private lives, allowing her to observe their relationships, their business dealings, and most dangerously, their secrets. The Morrison plantation in the late 1830s was a place of barely concealed tensions and simmering violence. Thomas Morrison, the patriarch, was struggling with debts from failed investments and declining tobacco prices. His wife, Margaret, was conducting a poorly disguised affair with a neighboring planter's son. Their eldest son, William, had developed a laudanum addiction that was consuming increasingly large portions of the family's remaining wealth. And their youngest daughter, Catherine, had formed an attachment to an enslaved stable hand that threatened to create a scandal if it became public knowledge. Ruth, with her sharp eyes and sharper intelligence, had witnessed all of these family dramas during her years of service. She had seen the forged documents that Thomas Morrison used to hide assets from creditors. She had observed Margaret's secret meetings with her lover in the rose garden. She had noticed William's dilated pupils and erratic behavior long before anyone else in the household. Most significantly, she had discovered Catherine's pregnancy before Catherine herself had fully understood her condition. This knowledge should have made Ruth valuable, perhaps even provided her with leverage for better treatment or eventual freedom. But in the paranoid atmosphere of a failing plantation, knowledge in the hands of an enslaved person was seen not as an asset, but as an existential threat. When Thomas Morrison realized that his daughter's kitchen servant knew too much about the family's private affairs, he began looking for ways to eliminate Ruth as a potential source of information that could destroy what remained of the Morrison family's reputation. The opportunity came in April 1837, during a dinner party that the Morrisons were hosting for several prominent Virginia families. Ruth, then 19 years old, was supervising the kitchen staff in preparing an elaborate multi-course meal designed to demonstrate that the Morrison plantation was still prosperous despite rumors of financial trouble. The pressure was enormous. The standards were impossibly high, and the consequences of failure were severe. During the preparation of the main course, a roasted duck with cherry sauce
that required precise timing and temperature control, Ruth made a minor error in judgment. She removed the duck from the oven approximately 3 minutes too early, resulting in meat that was slightly underdone near the bone.
For most households, this would have been a trivial issue, easily corrected or simply overlooked. But for Thomas Morrison, already humiliated by his financial failures and desperate to maintain appearances before his guests, it represented an intolerable failure by property that he had expected to perform flawlessly. Morrison's rage was immediate and terrifying. He stormed into the kitchen while Ruth was frantically trying to return the duck to the oven, grabbed her by the arm with enough force to leave bruises, and began screaming about incompetence and the worthlessness of slaves who couldn't follow simple instructions. But his fury went beyond mere anger at a cooking mistake. This was about control, about power, and, most dangerously, about eliminating a witness who knew too much about his family's secrets. What happened next would be disputed in later years, with different witnesses offering conflicting accounts that reflected their own positions within the plantation's social hierarchy. What is undisputed is that Thomas Morrison seized a container of lye water, the caustic chemical solution used for cleaning stubborn stains and grease from kitchen surfaces, and threw its contents directly into Ruth's face while she was still holding the roasting pan. The lye water was concentrated and hot, having been prepared earlier that day for cleaning the kitchen after the dinner service. When it struck Ruth's face, it immediately began the chemical reaction that would destroy her vision permanently. The alkaline solution burned through the delicate tissues of her eyes, causing pain so intense that witnesses later said her screams could be heard throughout the plantation house, interrupting the dinner party and sending several guests into shocked silence. Ruth collapsed on the kitchen floor, her hands clawing at her face in a futile attempt to stop the burning sensation that was destroying her eyes.
The other kitchen staff stood frozen, terrified to intervene in their owner's violence, but horrified by what they were witnessing. Margaret Morrison appeared in the doorway, took one look at the scene, and immediately understood that her husband had just committed an act that could have serious legal and social consequences if it became public knowledge. The medical response was delayed and inadequate. By the time a physician arrived nearly 2 hours after the attack, the damage to Ruth's eyes was irreversible. The lye had burned through her corneas, damaged her retinas, and caused such severe chemical trauma that the doctor could do little except wash her face with water and vinegar, apply soothing ointments to the burns on her skin, and privately inform Thomas Morrison that his property would be permanently blind. For 3 weeks, Ruth lay in the slave quarters with bandages covering her ruined eyes, experiencing a pain that gradually diminished but never completely disappeared. The other enslaved people on the plantation cared for her as best they could, bringing her water and food, helping her with basic tasks, and trying to prepare her for a life without sight. But what none of them realized was that Ruth's blindness, while devastating,
was also transforming her in ways that would make her far more dangerous than she had ever been with perfect vision. As the bandages were finally removed, and Ruth confronted the permanent darkness that would define the rest of her life, she discovered something unexpected. Her other senses, no longer dominated by the constant input of visual information, were becoming extraordinarily acute. She could hear conversations from rooms away, distinguish individual people by the sound of their footsteps, and identify foods by smell with a precision that amazed the plantation's cook. Most remarkably, she developed an almost supernatural ability to read people's emotional states through subtle changes in their voice, breathing patterns, and the small movements that sighted people make unconsciously. The blindness that Thomas Morrison had inflicted as punishment became Ruth's education in a different way of perceiving the world. Where sighted people relied on appearance and visual deception, Ruth learned to detect truth through sound and touch. Where others could be fooled by facial expressions and carefully maintained appearances, Ruth developed the ability to sense fear, guilt, and dishonesty through indicators that couldn't be visually controlled. But Thomas Morrison didn't wait to discover what Ruth might become in her blindness. Within 2 months of the attack, he sold her to a slave trader passing through Virginia, eager to remove the evidence of his violence and the witness to his family's secrets. The sale was conducted quickly and quietly, with Ruth being transferred to new ownership for the remarkably low price of $200, less than half what a healthy kitchen worker would typically command, but still more than Morrison had expected to receive for damaged property. The trader who purchased Ruth was a man named Calvin Jenks, who specialized in acquiring enslaved people with various disabilities and selling them to buyers who wanted workers at discount prices. Jenks had a reputation for particular cruelty toward his human merchandise, viewing their disabilities as justification for even more brutal treatment than the already horrific standards of the slave trade. He kept Ruth chained in the back of his wagon for the journey south, offering her minimal food and water, and making no accommodations for her blindness during the weeks of travel. But during that nightmare journey, Ruth was learning. She memorized the rhythms of Jenks's daily routine, the sounds that indicated when he was drunk or sober, and the patterns of how he interacted with other traders and potential buyers. She began to understand that blindness, while limiting her ability to see threats, also made people underestimate her intelligence and awareness. Jenks and the other traders spoke freely about their business in her presence, assuming that a blind woman couldn't understand or remember information that might be valuable. By the time they reached the Richmond slave market in September 1837, Ruth had accumulated detailed knowledge about Jenks's operations, his business contacts, and most importantly, his illegal activities. The slave trade, while legal, was heavily regulated, and Ruth had overheard enough conversations to understand that Jenks was systematically falsifying documentation, avoiding customs duties, and occasionally selling free black people who had been kidnapped from northern states. The Richmond market was one of the largest slave trading centers in the Upper South, a place where hundreds of human beings were bought and sold each month in transactions that combined the bureaucratic precision of legitimate business with the moral horror of treating people as property. Ruth was displayed on the auction block along with dozens of other enslaved people, her blindness clearly visible to potential buyers, her price marked down significantly because of her disability. Most buyers passed over Ruth immediately, seeing only her limitation and not recognizing the extraordinary abilities she had developed to compensate for her lost vision. But one man stopped to examine her more carefully, asking questions about her work history, her skills, and most specifically, her ability to perform kitchen tasks without sight. That man was Cornelius Ashford, a Georgia plantation owner who was in Richmond specifically looking for bargain purchases, enslaved workers whose disabilities made them cheaper, but who might still provide useful labor. Ashford had recently dismissed his head cook after discovering that she had been stealing food to feed her children, and he needed a replacement who could prepare meals for his household and occasional dinner guests. When Jenks quoted a price of $250 for Ruth, emphasizing that while she was blind, she had years of experience as a kitchen worker and would be unlikely to run away given her condition, Ashford saw an opportunity. A sighted cook of Ruth's experience would cost $600 or more. A blind cook who couldn't escape and who would be grateful for any position was worth far less, but might still perform adequately if properly supervised. The sale was completed on September 23, 1837. Ruth became the legal property of Cornelius Ashford, transferred like livestock with paperwork that described her as one Negro woman called Ruth, blind, age approximately 19 years, experienced cook, sold as is, without warranty. Ashford paid Jenks in cash, loaded Ruth into his wagon alongside several bags of seed and farm equipment he had purchased, and began the journey south to his plantation in central Georgia. During that trip, which lasted nearly 2 weeks, Ashford and Ruth had their first extensive conversations. He was curious about how she had lost her sight, whether she could still perform complex cooking tasks, and most importantly, whether she understood that her blindness made her completely dependent on his charity and goodwill. His questions revealed a man who viewed her disability not with compassion, but as a form of control. She couldn't see to escape, couldn't navigate unfamiliar territory without help, and couldn't threaten his authority because she was fundamentally helpless. Ruth answered his questions with the perfect combination of deference and competence, presenting herself as exactly what Ashford wanted, a skilled but powerless worker who would be grateful for the opportunity to serve him. She described her cooking experience in detail, assured him that she had learned to work by touch and smell, and carefully crafted an image of herself as someone who had accepted her disability and her enslaved status with Christian resignation. But what Ashford couldn't see, what his reliance on visual assessment prevented him from perceiving, was that Ruth was simultaneously conducting her own evaluation of him. She was listening to the way he spoke about his plantation, his finances, and his social position. She was noting the slight tremor in his voice when he discussed certain business matters, the defensiveness in his tone when he mentioned his relationships with neighboring planters, and the hints of paranoia that emerged when he talked about people he suspected of cheating
or betraying him. By the time they arrived at Ashford's plantation in early October 1837, Ruth had created a detailed mental profile of the man who now owned her. He was insecure about his social status, anxious about his financial position, prone to suspicious thinking, and most importantly, completely convinced that a blind woman posed no threat whatsoever to his control and authority. The Ashford plantation, which he had named Harmony Hall, in an ironic choice given the tensions that defined the property, was a medium-sized cotton operation with approximately 40 enslaved workers and about 800 acres under cultivation. The main house was a two-story Greek Revival structure that Ashford had built to impress visitors and announce his arrival into Georgia's planter class. Though the opulence of the facade disguised serious structural problems and deferred maintenance that reflected his underlying financial troubles.
Ruth was installed in a small room adjacent to the kitchen, a space that had previously housed the dismissed cook, and which came equipped with a narrow bed, a single chest for personal belongings, and a small window that Ruth would never be able to see through. Ashford introduced her to the household staff, 3 other enslaved people who worked in the main house, along with a rotating group from the field workers who were assigned to help with heavy tasks. The first few weeks at Harmony Hall were dedicated to Ruth learning the layout of the kitchen and the main house through careful exploration. She spent hours each day memorizing distances, counting steps between rooms, identifying creaking floorboards and loose stairs, and building a complete mental map of the space that would become her prison and eventually her weapon. The other enslaved people on the plantation watched this process with a mixture of pity and admiration. They had initially assumed that a blind woman would be nearly helpless, requiring constant assistance, and probably failing at her assigned tasks. Instead, they witnessed Ruth navigating the house with increasing confidence, preparing meals with precision that matched or exceeded what their sighted former cook had achieved, and demonstrating an awareness of her environment that seemed almost supernatural. What they didn't realize was that Ruth was doing far more than simply learning to function despite her blindness. She was conducting a systematic intelligence-gathering operation, using her heightened hearing to eavesdrop on Ashford's private conversations, her sensitive touch to examine documents left on tables and desks, and her exceptional memory to catalog every detail of the plantation's operations, finances, and social relationships. Within 3 months of her arrival at Harmony Hall, Ruth knew more about Cornelius Ashford's affairs than anyone else on the plantation, possibly including Ashford himself. She had discovered that he was deeply in debt to several Richmond banks, that he was engaged in fraudulent schemes involving cotton futures and forged shipping documents, and that he had systematically cheated his business partners out of thousands of dollars through creative accounting and outright theft. Most significantly, Ruth had identified the specific individuals who had been victimized by Ashford's fraud. The Patterson family, who had invested in a joint cotton venture that Ashford had secretly bankrupted while hiding the losses. The Caldwell brothers, who had lent him money secured by property that Ashford had already mortgaged to other creditors. And James Whitmore, a Richmond merchant who had discovered Ashford's schemes and was threatening legal action that could result in criminal prosecution.
This information became Ruth's ammunition in a war that she began planning in the winter of 1837 to 1838, during the long, dark nights when she lay awake in her small room, building a strategy that would take 13 years to fully execute. She understood that she couldn't simply expose Ashford's crimes through normal channels. No court would accept the testimony of an enslaved woman, and bringing evidence to authorities would likely result in her being sold away or killed before any investigation could proceed. Instead, Ruth conceived a far more elaborate plan. She would use her blindness, the very disability that made her seem powerless, as camouflage for a systematic campaign to destroy Ashford through the same methods he had used against others: financial manipulation, psychological pressure, and ultimately betrayal by people he trusted. The first phase of her plan required establishing herself as an indispensable and completely unthreatening presence in Ashford's household. Ruth threw herself into her work as cook with an intensity that exceeded all expectations. She prepared meals that impressed Ashford's guests and enhanced his social reputation. She managed the kitchen with efficient authority that made the household run smoothly. Most importantly, she made herself so valuable that Ashford began to depend on her presence and her work in ways that went far beyond normal master-slave relationships. By 1840, Ruth had become the unofficial manager of the entire household, with responsibilities that extended well beyond cooking. Ashford consulted her about menu planning for important dinners, asked her advice about household purchases, and even occasionally discussed his business concerns in her presence, convinced that a blind woman couldn't possibly understand or act on information about cotton prices and shipping schedules. This trust gave Ruth access to increasingly sensitive information and, more importantly, opportunities to subtly manipulate Ashford's decisions in ways that would serve her long-term objectives. She began suggesting menu choices that would bring Ashford into contact with specific guests, people she had identified as potential allies or sources of information. She recommended household purchases that would connect Ashford to certain merchants and suppliers who might prove useful to her purposes. Most subtly, she started making small comments and observations that would plant seeds of paranoia about his business partners and associates. But the most crucial element of Ruth's plan was establishing a network of contacts beyond the plantation. As a blind cook, she seemed completely isolated and powerless, incapable of communicating with the outside world. In reality, she had developed an elaborate system for exchanging information with free black people who visited the plantation as tradesmen, enslaved people from neighboring properties who came for social gatherings, and even sympathetic white abolitionists who occasionally passed through central Georgia. These contacts were established through careful cultivation over years. Ruth would prepare special meals for visiting tradesmen, earning their gratitude and creating opportunities for quiet conversations. She would share food with enslaved people from other plantations, building relationships based on mutual support and trust. Most remarkably, she made contact with members of Georgia's small but active abolitionist community through a network of code words and subtle signals embedded in seemingly innocent interactions. By 1845, 8 years after her arrival at Harmony Hall, Ruth had created an intelligence network that extended throughout central Georgia and into South Carolina
and Virginia. She could send messages through this network, receive information about Ashford's business contacts and enemies, and coordinate activities that appeared completely random but were actually carefully orchestrated elements of her revenge plan. The key to her network's security was that it operated primarily through non-visual communication methods that Ruth had mastered, but that sighted people barely noticed. A specific rhythm when knocking on a door could convey coded messages. The arrangement of kitchen utensils could indicate whether it was safe to talk. Even the seasoning of certain dishes could communicate information to people who had been taught to recognize the codes. Through this network, Ruth began the patient work of destroying Cornelius Ashford's business relationships and financial stability. She passed information about his fraudulent schemes to people who had been victimized by him, carefully timing the revelations to create maximum damage. She arranged for certain letters to go missing from his desk, while ensuring that other, more incriminating correspondence was accidentally left where his business partners might discover it.
Most devastatingly, she began spreading rumors through her network about Ashford's unreliability and dishonesty, rumors that seemed to emerge from multiple independent sources, but which all originated from the same blind cook that everyone assumed was powerless and isolated. The effects of this campaign were gradual but relentless. Ashford's credit began to dry up as banks became nervous about his financial stability. His business partners started asking uncomfortable questions about discrepancies in their joint accounts. Merchants who had extended him generous terms began demanding cash payment. Most significantly, the families he had defrauded, the Pattersons, the Caldwells, and James Whitmore, began coordinating their legal and financial responses to his schemes, creating a coalition of enemies that would eventually force him into the exact position Ruth needed him to occupy: desperate, isolated, and vulnerable to manipulation. By 1850, Cornelius Ashford's financial situation had deteriorated to the point where he was facing imminent bankruptcy and possible criminal prosecution. He had no idea that his troubles were the result of a 13-year campaign orchestrated by his blind cook, a woman he still viewed as nothing more than useful property. And he certainly had no idea that his greatest crisis was still to come, or that it would involve a forced marriage that would place him completely in the power of the woman whose eyes he had never truly seen, but who had seen through him with perfect clarity from the moment of their first conversation. The crisis that would force Cornelius Ashford into his grotesque marriage began in January 1851, when James Whitmore finally assembled enough evidence to file formal fraud charges with the Georgia Superior Court.
Whitmore, the Richmond merchant, who had been systematically documenting Ashford's schemes for over a decade, had obtained copies of forged shipping manifests, fraudulent cotton certificates, and most damning of all, correspondence between Ashford and corrupt warehouse operators who had helped him claim payment for cotton shipments that had never existed. The legal filings sent shockwaves through Central Georgia's Planter Society. Fraud accusations between businessmen were common enough, but Whitmore's case was extraordinarily well documented,
and involved amounts of money that couldn't be dismissed as simple accounting errors or business disagreements. If the charges proceeded to trial, Ashford would face not just financial ruin, but potential criminal conviction, carrying sentences that ranged from massive fines to actual imprisonment, a fate that would utterly destroy any gentleman's social position and family legacy. Within days of the filing, Ashford's remaining creditors began calling in their loans, no longer willing to extend credit to a man who might soon be a convicted criminal. The Patterson family filed a civil suit seeking recovery of their lost investments, plus damages. The Caldwell brothers demanded immediate repayment of loans that Ashford had been servicing through minimum interest payments for years. Even smaller creditors, who had previously been patient about delayed payments, suddenly insisted on immediate settlement of their accounts. By February, Ashford was facing financial obligations totaling over $47,000, an amount that exceeded the total value of his plantation, enslaved workers, equipment, and personal property combined. His attorneys informed him that bankruptcy was inevitable, and that the fraud charges would almost certainly proceed to trial, regardless of his financial situation. They estimated his chances of acquittal at less than 20%, given the quality of evidence that Whitmore had assembled and the number of victims who would testify against him. But what Ashford didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known, was that James Whitmore had been in secret communication with Ruth for over 3 years, receiving information about Ashford's activities through the network she had so carefully constructed. Every piece of evidence in Whitmore's legal filing had been either provided by Ruth or obtained through leads she had supplied. The timing of the charges had been coordinated to coincide with Ashford's maximum financial vulnerability, creating a crisis that would leave him desperate enough to accept whatever terms his enemies chose to impose. The trap was sprung on February 14, 1851, when 3 men arrived at Harmony Hall requesting a private meeting with Ashford. They introduced themselves as representatives of his major creditors, the Patterson family, the Caldwell brothers, and James Whitmore's commercial interests. What they didn't mention was that all 3 had been carefully selected and coached by Ruth through her network of contacts, prepared to deliver an ultimatum that would force Ashford into the exact position she had been engineering for 13 years. The meeting took place in Ashford's study, a room that Ruth had cleaned and dusted countless times, a space whose every dimension and feature she had memorized through years of careful exploration. She wasn't present during the actual conversation. Enslaved people weren't permitted to attend such meetings. But she had positioned herself in the adjacent butler's pantry, a space separated from the study by a wall thin enough that her exceptional hearing could capture every word spoken by the men who were about to destroy her owner's life. The spokesman for the creditors was Edward Patterson, eldest son of the family that had lost over $15,000 to Ashford's fraudulent cotton scheme. Patterson's voice was cold and formal as he outlined the situation with brutal clarity. Mr. Ashford, you are facing criminal fraud charges that will almost certainly result in conviction. You are insolvent, with debts exceeding your assets by a factor of nearly 2 to 1. Your property will be seized, your enslaved workers will be sold at auction, and you yourself will likely spend the next several years in prison. Ashford's response was weak and desperate,
exactly as Ruth had predicted it would be. She could hear the tremor in his voice as he tried to negotiate, offering payment plans and promising to liquidate assets to satisfy his creditors. But Patterson cut him off with the dismissive tone of a man who held all the power and knew it. "We're not here to negotiate payment schedules," Patterson continued. "We're here to offer you a single alternative to complete destruction. An alternative that will allow you to retain your property, avoid criminal prosecution, and continue living at Harmony Hall, albeit under significantly altered circumstances." Through the thin wall, Ruth smiled in the darkness that was her constant companion. This was the moment she had been orchestrating for over a decade, the convergence of 1,000 small actions and careful manipulations into a single, perfect opportunity for revenge. "The terms are simple and non-negotiable," Patterson said. "You will marry your cook, the blind woman called Ruth, in a legal and public ceremony. The marriage will be properly witnessed, legally recorded, and announced to your neighbors and associates.
You will live as her husband, present her to society as your wife, and maintain this arrangement for the remainder of your natural life." The silence that followed this statement was so complete that Ruth could hear Ashford's breathing accelerate into something approaching hyperventilation. When he finally found his voice, it emerged as a strangled whisper. That's impossible. No one would. I can't possibly." "You can, and you will," interrupted Samuel Caldwell, speaking for the first time. His voice carried the flat certainty of someone delivering an ultimatum rather than opening a negotiation. "The alternative is that we proceed with both criminal prosecution and civil suits. You'll be bankrupt, imprisoned, and utterly ruined. Your name will become synonymous with fraud and dishonesty throughout Georgia and Virginia. Every plantation owner who ever trusted you will know that you betrayed them for profit." "But marriage to my own—" Ashford couldn't even complete the sentence, his voice breaking on the enormity of what they were demanding. "To your own property, yes," Patterson said, and Ruth could hear the edge of contempt in his voice. "A blind woman, no less. A degraded and humiliating arrangement that will make you a laughingstock among your peers. But you'll be a living laughingstock, Mr. Ashford, not a imprisoned bankrupt. And you'll retain ownership of this plantation and your remaining assets, which is considerably more than you'll have after criminal conviction and forced liquidation." James Whitmore, who had been silent until this point, finally spoke. His voice was calm and measured, carrying the authority of someone who had spent years building an unassailable legal case. "We've prepared all the necessary documents, Mr. Ashford. A marriage contract, debt restructuring agreements, and a legal settlement that will dismiss the criminal charges in exchange for your compliance. The ceremony is scheduled for March 3rd, 2 weeks from today. You'll have that time to prepare yourself and inform your household of the arrangement." "And if I refuse?" Ashford asked, though Ruth could hear in his voice that he already knew the answer. "Then tomorrow morning we file additional criminal charges involving your forged cotton certificates. By tomorrow afternoon, the sheriff will arrive with a warrant for your arrest. By tomorrow evening, you'll be sitting in the county jail while your property is inventoried for seizure. By next week, you'll be standing trial for fraud with a certainty of conviction. And by next month, you'll be beginning a prison sentence that will last at least 5 years, possibly longer. The choice, such as it was no choice at all. Ashford could accept temporary humiliation in exchange for continued freedom and property, or he could face immediate and permanent destruction. Ruth knew, had calculated with mathematical precision, that a man like Ashford, whose entire identity was built on social status and material wealth, would choose humiliation over complete annihilation. He would tell himself that he could find a way to escape the arrangement later, that circumstances might change, that he was accepting degradation as a tactical retreat rather than as permanent defeat. He was wrong, of course, but he wouldn't understand how wrong until it was far too late. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, Ashford gave his answer in a voice that sounded dead and hollow. "I accept your terms. I'll marry her. When do I sign the documents?" "Now," Patterson said, and Ruth heard the rustling of papers being spread across Ashford's desk. "We've brought everything that requires your signature, the marriage contract, the debt agreements, and the legal settlement. Your attorney has reviewed them and found them technically proper, though morally unconscionable."
But morality isn't really your concern at this point, is it, Mr. Ashford? For the next 30 minutes, Ruth listened as Ashford signed away his freedom and his dignity, committing himself to a marriage that would transform his blind cook from property into wife, from slave into legal partner with rights and status that would horrify every person who learned of the arrangement. She heard the scratch of his pen across paper, the occasional question about specific clauses, and the flat, emotionless responses from the 3 men who were executing her revenge with the precision of lawyers conducting a standard business transaction. When the signing was complete, Patterson delivered one final instruction that confirmed Ruth's suspicions about how thoroughly her network had infiltrated every aspect of this conspiracy. "You'll inform Ruth of the arrangement tonight, Mr. Ashford. You'll explain that you've decided to honor her years of faithful service by elevating her to the status of wife. You'll present this as your own choice, motivated by Christian charity and a desire to demonstrate your commitment to benevolent treatment of your enslaved workers. Any suggestion that you're being coerced, any attempt to portray yourself as a victim, and the entire agreement becomes void. Do you understand?" "I understand," Ashford whispered. "I'm to present my own humiliation as voluntary charity. How perfectly Christian." "Indeed," Whitmore said dryly. "We're all terrible sinners, Mr. Ashford, but at least some of us pay for our sins in ways that serve justice rather than simply inflicting suffering on others." After the 3 men departed, Ruth remained in the butler's pantry, listening to Ashford's ragged breathing from the study. She could hear him pacing, could sense his agitation and despair through the small sounds that penetrated the wall between them. Part of her, a small part that she had carefully cultivated over 13 years, felt something approaching pity for what he was experiencing. But a much larger part, the part that had lived in darkness since age 19 because of this man's casual cruelty, felt only cold satisfaction. This was justice,
not in the legal sense that courts and laws pretended to deliver, but in the deeper sense of cosmic balance. Ashford had blinded her to eliminate a witness to his family's secrets and to punish a minor kitchen error. Now he would be forced to live with that blind witness as his wife, dependent on her for daily meals, vulnerable to her in ways that his sighted arrogance prevented him from fully appreciating. That evening, Ashford summoned Ruth to his study with a formality that was unusual for their normal interactions. She navigated the familiar path from her room to his office with the confidence of someone who had walked these hallways hundreds of times in complete darkness, counting steps and using subtle acoustic cues to orient herself perfectly. When she entered the study, she could sense his position behind his desk through the sound of his breathing and the small movements of his chair. "Ruth," he began, and she could hear the strain in his voice as he tried to find words for what he needed to say. "I have something important to discuss with you. A decision I've made about your future and mine." She stood quietly, her face tilted slightly upward in the manner of blind people listening carefully, her expression neutral and patient. This was the performance of a lifetime. She needed to appear surprised, confused, and ultimately grateful for the honor he was about to bestow on her. Any hint that she had anticipated this moment or had played any role in engineering it would raise suspicions that could unravel everything. "I've been thinking a great deal lately about Christian duty and the proper treatment of those in my care," Ashford continued, and Ruth marveled at how convincing he sounded, despite knowing that every word was forced. "You've served this household faithfully for many years, despite your disability. You've never complained, never failed in your duties, and you've demonstrated a level of competence that exceeds what I had any right to expect." Ruth murmured a quiet, "Thank you, sir," playing her role perfectly. "In recognition of your service, and in accordance with my Christian obligations, I've decided to offer you something that I believe will dramatically improve your circumstances." He paused, and Ruth could hear him swallowing hard, steeling himself for what came next. "I'm going to marry you, Ruth. I'm going to make you my wife in a legal ceremony that will be properly witnessed and recorded. You'll become the mistress of this household, with all the rights and protections that status entails." The silence that followed was carefully calculated. Ruth needed to appear shocked, overwhelmed, possibly confused about whether she had understood correctly. She let her mouth fall slightly open, raised one hand to her chest in a gesture of surprise, and after a long moment whispered, "Sir, I don't understand. Marriage? To me?" "Yes," Ashford said, and she could hear both resignation and forced enthusiasm in his voice. "I know it's unusual. I know it will surprise people and possibly cause some talk among the neighbors. But I've come to believe that it's the right thing to do. You've been more than just a cook to this household. You've been essential. And I want to honor that by giving you the protection and dignity of marriage." Ruth let a tremor enter her voice, a convincing simulation of emotional overwhelm. I never imagined. Sir, I'm blind. I'm your property. How can I possibly be your wife?" "You won't be property any longer," Ashford explained, warming slightly to his performance now that she seemed to be accepting the narrative he was presenting.
The marriage will free you from enslaved status. You'll become a free woman, legally my equal in the eyes of the law. Our marriage will demonstrate to all of Georgia that Christian charity can transcend even the most unconventional circumstances. It was a masterful piece of fiction, Ruth had to admit. Ashford was reframing his forced humiliation as voluntary benevolence, his coerced degradation as enlightened Christian action. If she hadn't known the truth, if she hadn't spent 13 years engineering this exact outcome, she might have actually believed that he was making a genuine choice, motivated by conscience rather than desperation. "I don't know what to say," Ruth whispered, allowing genuine emotion to color her voice, though not the emotion Ashford assumed. It's overwhelming. May I ask, when would this ceremony take place?" "March 3rd, Ashford said. "Just over 2 weeks from now. I've already arranged for a minister and sent invitations to several neighbors. The ceremony will be held here at Harmony Hall in the main parlor. You'll need a proper dress, of course. I'll arrange for that to be made." Ruth nodded slowly, her mind already racing ahead to the thousands of details that would need to be managed over the next 2 weeks. But outwardly, she maintained the appearance of a blind woman struggling to process unexpected news. "Sir, I'm honored beyond words. I'll try to be worthy of this extraordinary kindness you're showing me." "I'm sure you will," Ashford said, and Ruth could detect the bitter irony in his voice, despite his attempt to maintain the fiction of benevolent choice. "You may return to your quarters now. We'll discuss the specific arrangements tomorrow." As Ruth left the study and made her way back through the darkened hallways of Harmony Hall, she allowed herself a small smile that no one could see. The trap had been sprung perfectly. Ashford had accepted his role in the performance they would present to the world, and in 2 weeks she would transform from property to wife, from powerless to protected, from victim to something far more dangerous. But what Ashford didn't realize, what his sighted arrogance prevented him from understanding, was that the marriage wasn't the conclusion of Ruth's revenge. It was merely the beginning of the final phase, the opening of a door that would give her access to the one thing she needed to complete the justice that had been denied her 13 years earlier. Proximity, legitimacy, and time. The 2 weeks before the wedding passed with a surreal quality that left everyone at Harmony Hall struggling to process what was about to happen. Word spread quickly through the plantation's enslaved community that their blind cook was being elevated to the status of wife, a development so unprecedented that initial reactions ranged from disbelief to concern about what it might mean for the rest of them. Ruth moved through this period with careful attention to her performance. She needed to appear humble and grateful, overwhelmed by the honor being bestowed on her, but also increasingly confident as she prepared to assume her new role. She consulted with Ashford about household arrangements, asked respectful questions about her future responsibilities, and generally behaved like someone who was taking seriously the position she was about to occupy. The dress that Ashford commissioned for the wedding was created by a seamstress from the neighboring town, a woman who arrived at Harmony Hall with fabric samples and measuring tapes,
clearly uncomfortable with the assignment, but professional enough to complete it without comment.
Ruth stood patiently during the fittings, unable to see the white silk and lace that were being shaped to her body, but able to feel through the seamstress's touch and occasional comments that the garment was being made with genuine care and quality materials. "It's beautiful," the seamstress said during the final fitting, a comment directed more at the other household staff who were watching than at Ruth herself. Whatever people might think about this arrangement, no one will be able to say that Mr. Ashford didn't provide his bride with a proper wedding dress. The invitations that Ashford had sent to neighboring plantation owners and prominent local families generated responses that ranged from polite acceptance to barely concealed shock. Most people assumed that Ashford had suffered some kind of mental breakdown brought on by his well-known financial troubles, and they were attending the wedding primarily to witness what they expected to be a spectacle of eccentricity or possibly madness. What none of them suspected was that they were actually attending the culmination of a 13-year conspiracy, or that the blind woman they pitied was the architect of everything they were about to witness. March 3rd, 1851, dawned gray and humid, with low clouds that threatened rain and a heavy atmosphere that seemed to press down on Harmony Hall like a physical weight. Ruth woke before sunrise in the small room that had been her quarters for nearly 14 years, the space where she had planned and dreamed and calculated the revenge that was about to reach its crucial milestone. She dressed carefully in the white silk wedding gown, relying on touch to ensure that every button was properly fastened, every fold of fabric was correctly arranged. She couldn't see her reflection in the mirror that had been placed in her room, but she could sense through the reactions of the household staff who helped her prepare that the overall effect was striking. A blind woman in an elegant white dress, her scarred face partially concealed by a delicate veil, her posture erect and dignified despite the grotesque circumstances of the ceremony she was about to undergo. By noon, the guests had begun arriving at Harmony Hall. Ruth could hear their carriages on the gravel drive, their voices carrying through the open windows as they gathered in clusters to discuss the unprecedented event they were witnessing. She recognized many of the voices from years of serving dinner parties and social gatherings. The Patterson family, several Caldwell relatives, other plantation owners who did business with Ashford, and even a few prominent citizens from the county seat who had apparently decided that curiosity outweighed social propriety. The ceremony itself was scheduled for 2 p.m. in the main parlor, a room that Ruth had cleaned and dusted countless times, but which she had never entered as anything other than a servant. Now, as the household staff guided her to her position beside Cornelius Ashford, she was claiming that space as an equal, transforming herself from property to partner through the power of words and witnesses. The minister who performed the ceremony was Reverend Thomas Clayton from a small church in neighboring Putnam County, a man who had been persuaded to accept this assignment through a combination of financial incentives and appeals to Christian charity. His voice was steady and professional as he began the traditional wedding service, though Ruth could detect an underlying discomfort in his tone that suggested he was as disturbed by the ceremony as many of the assembled guests. "Dearly beloved," Clayton began, "we are gathered here today in the sight of God
and these witnesses to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony. Marriage is an honorable estate, instituted by God, and signifying the mystical union between Christ and his church. Ruth listened to the familiar words with a strange sense of detachment. She had attended enough weddings as a servant to know the traditional service by heart, but hearing it applied to her own marriage, a union founded on coercion and revenge rather than love, gave the words a hollow, almost mocking quality. When Reverend Clayton reached the part about objections, asking if anyone present knew of any lawful impediment to this marriage, the silence was profound and uncomfortable. Ruth could sense the guests shifting in their seats, probably wondering if someone would be brave enough to stand and object to this grotesque arrangement. But no one spoke. Whatever private thoughts they harbored about the appropriateness of a white plantation owner marrying his blind enslaved cook, they kept them silent in the face of what appeared to be a legal and voluntary union. The vows themselves were the most difficult part of the performance. Ashford's voice was barely audible as he promised to love, honor, and cherish Ruth for the rest of his life. She could hear the strain in every word, the barely suppressed disgust and resignation that colored his responses to the minister's questions. When it was her turn to speak, Ruth projected her voice clearly and confidently, ensuring that every person in the room could hear her acceptance of Cornelius Ashford as her lawful husband. I, Ruth, take you, Cornelius Ashford, to be my wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part. The phrase, till death do us part, hung in the air with an almost physical presence. Ruth knew, even if no one else in the room suspected, that those words had a very specific and limited time frame. Ashford's death was already planned, already set in motion through methods that he couldn't see and wouldn't understand until it was far too late to prevent. When Reverend Clayton instructed Ashford to kiss his bride, the room fell into a silence so complete that Ruth could hear people holding their breath. She tilted her face upward, presenting her scarred cheek for the ceremonial kiss that would seal their legal union. Ashford's lips barely brushed her skin, the contact lasting less than a second, but it was enough to satisfy the requirements of the ceremony and mark the moment when Ruth transformed from enslaved property to free wife. I now pronounce you man and wife, Clayton announced, his voice carrying relief that the difficult ceremony had been completed without incident. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. The reception that followed was awkward and brief. Guests offered stiff congratulations to the newlyweds, struggling to find appropriate words for an occasion that defied all social conventions. Ruth accepted their well wishes with gracious humility, playing the role of a grateful bride who had been blessed with unexpected good fortune. Ashford stood beside her, responding to comments with mechanical politeness that barely concealed his inner turmoil. But through it all, Ruth was already thinking ahead to the next phase of her plan. The marriage had given her legal status and protection, had placed her in a position where she could act with authority rather than as powerless property. Most importantly, it had given her unrestricted access to Ashford's private spaces, his daily routines, and his most vulnerable moments. As the last guests departed and the household staff began cleaning up from the reception, Ruth stood in the main parlor that was now legally hers as much as Ashford's. She couldn't see the elegant furniture, the expensive paintings, or the crystal chandeliers that had represented his wealth and status. But she could sense the weight of the moment, the culmination of 13 years of patient planning and careful manipulation. Cornelius Ashford had stolen her sight and treated her as property. Now she was his wife, his legal equal, and soon, very soon, she would be his widow. The wedding in darkness had been completed. The final phase of her revenge could begin, and Ashford, standing in his study with a whiskey glass trembling in his hand, had no idea that the ceremony he had just endured was not his punishment, but merely the opening movement of a symphony of suffering that would end with his death and Ruth's freedom. The marriage certificate would be filed with the county clerk the next morning, making their union a matter of permanent legal record. And somewhere in the Georgia State Archives, that document would survive for generations, a yellowed piece of paper that hinted at mysteries it could never fully explain. Mysteries about justice, revenge, and what happens when the powerless finally gain the power to make the powerful pay for their crimes. But those mysteries would only be solved by people who understood that sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones you can't see, and that blindness can be not a disability, but a weapon wielded with precision by someone patient enough to wait 13 years for the perfect moment of revenge. The first night of their marriage, Cornelius Ashford locked himself in what had been his private bedroom, refusing to share sleeping quarters with the woman who was now legally his wife. Ruth made no objection to this arrangement. In fact, she had anticipated it with the same precision that had characterized every other aspect of her 13-year campaign. A man like Ashford, forced into marriage through financial coercion, would cling desperately to whatever small assertions of autonomy he could manage. What Ashford didn't realize was that his insistence on privacy was actually serving Ruth's purposes perfectly. She needed him isolated, spending long hours alone, where his imagination could work against him, where the small anxieties she was carefully cultivating could grow into full-blown paranoia without the moderating influence of other people's presence. But as Ruth arranged her minimal belongings in the former guest bedroom, a space larger and more comfortable than the servants' quarters she had occupied for 13 years, she felt something unexpected, a moment of hesitation that caught her by surprise. Her hand trembled slightly as she touched the wooden box containing the arsenic and belladonna she had acquired through her network, substances that would slowly kill the man sleeping in the locked room down the hall. For just a moment, Ruth allowed herself to remember Cornelius Ashford, not as the monster who had purchased her, but as a human being who would soon die in agony because of decisions she had made. The hesitation lasted perhaps 10 seconds, a brief flicker of conscience in a mind that had been hardened by 13 years of patient hatred. Then she thought of her 3 children, sold away to different plantations, children she would never see again because this man had been too cheap and cruel to keep a family together. The moment of doubt vanished like smoke. She opened the wooden box and began her work. The first element of Ruth's strategy was to establish complete mastery over the household's daily operations. As Ashford's wife, rather than his property, she now had authority over the other enslaved people who worked in the main house, control over purchasing decisions, and most importantly, unrestricted access to every room except Ashford's locked bedroom. She exercised this new authority with careful deliberation, reorganizing the kitchen to give herself complete control over all food preparation. She restructured the daily cleaning schedule so that she personally handled Ashford's private spaces. Most crucially, she established herself as the person responsible for procuring medications and tonics. These changes were implemented gradually over the first 2 weeks of their marriage, each modification presented as a wife's natural desire to ensure her husband's comfort. Ashford, preoccupied with his financial troubles and social embarrassment, barely noticed the systematic way Ruth was positioning herself to control every aspect of his daily environment. But Ruth's real work was happening at a level Ashford couldn't perceive. She was beginning the patient process of poisoning him, not with a single lethal dose that would cause immediate death and invite investigation, but with carefully calibrated quantities of arsenic that would accumulate in his system over months, creating symptoms that would mimic natural illness. The arsenic came from an unexpected source, a free black pharmacist in Savannah named Jacob Chen, whose daughter had been one of the enslaved people Ruth had helped escape through her network 3 years earlier. Jacob owed Ruth a debt that could never be fully repaid, and when her coded message arrived requesting rat poison in medicinal quantities, he understood immediately what she intended and why. But Jacob did something Ruth hadn't anticipated. He sent the arsenic along with a carefully written note hidden inside the package wrapping. "I know what this is for, and I know why. But I also know that once you start down this path, there's no turning back. The poison will kill him slowly, painfully, but it will also kill something in you. Are you certain this is the justice you want, or just the revenge you need? If you choose to proceed, I'll never speak of this. But know that I tried to offer you a different path. J.C." Ruth ran her fingers over the raised letters Jacob had embossed into the paper so she could read them by touch. For the second time in as many days, she felt doubt creeping into her carefully constructed plan. Jacob was right. Poison was irreversible, final, and would transform her from victim seeking justice into murderer seeking vengeance. She sat alone in her room for 3 hours that night, the package of arsenic unopened on her lap, wrestling with the question Jacob had posed. Was this justice or merely revenge? And did the distinction even matter after 13 years of patient suffering? The answer came not from rational thought, but from a memory. Her youngest daughter's voice crying, "Mama, Mama," as she was dragged away to a wagon that would take her to a rice plantation in South Carolina. Ruth had begged Ashford to purchase the child, offering to work double hours, to take on any task, anything to keep her baby. And Ashford had laughed, actually laughed, and said, "I'm running a plantation, not an orphanage for colored children." Ruth opened the package and began measuring the first dose. She began adding minute quantities of arsenic to Ashford's morning coffee on March 5, 1851, just 2 days after their wedding. The dose was incredibly small, barely 1/10 of a grain, an amount so tiny that it produced no immediate symptoms. But Ruth understood that arsenic's true power came from chronic accumulation. Each tiny dose would build up in Ashford's tissues and organs until his body could no longer process and eliminate the poison faster than it was being introduced. While the arsenic did its slow chemical work, Ruth launched a parallel campaign of psychological warfare. She had spent 13 years studying Ashford's personality, identifying the specific triggers that would produce maximum emotional distress. Now, with unrestricted access to his living spaces and the legal authority of a wife, she could deploy this knowledge with devastating precision. The campaign began with subtle manipulations of Ashford's physical environment. Ruth would rearrange objects in his study by small increments, moving a book from one end of a shelf to the other, shifting his desk chair by a few inches. The changes were minor enough that Ashford might dismiss them as forgetfulness, but frequent enough that he couldn't ignore the pattern entirely. What made these manipulations particularly effective was that Ashford couldn't complain without sounding paranoid. How could he explain to anyone that he was being tormented by mysteriously moving objects? Who would take seriously a claim that his blind wife was somehow responsible for alterations that seemed to require sight to execute? But Ruth's most devastating psychological weapon was her apparent ability to know things that a blind person shouldn't be able to know. The breakthrough moment came during a dinner party in late March, when Ashford had reluctantly invited 2 neighboring plantation owners and their wives to Harmony Hall. He was desperate to maintain some appearance of normalcy, despite his degrading marriage, hoping that social connections might help stabilize his deteriorating financial situation. Ruth had prepared an elaborate meal, demonstrating the cooking skills that had made her valuable despite her blindness. But midway through the main course, she made a comment that froze every conversation at the table. "Mrs. Patterson, that's a lovely shade of green you're wearing this evening," Ruth said pleasantly. "It complements your complexion beautifully. And, Mr. Caldwell, I see you've grown a beard since your last visit. It suits you." The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. Ruth was blind. Everyone at the table knew she was blind, had seen her scarred eyes, had watched her navigate the house using touch and sound. Yet she had just accurately described the color of a guest's dress and noticed a physical change in a man's appearance that required vision to detect. Margaret Patterson was the first to speak, her voice tight with confusion and barely concealed fear. "Mrs. Ashford, how did you... you can't possibly..." "Can't I?" Ruth replied, her voice carrying a strange mixture of innocence and something darker. "I may not see as you do, but I perceive things in ways that sighted people often miss. The rustle of silk tells me about fabric weight and quality. The scent of dye reveals color. Green has a distinct mineral smell from the copper compounds used to create it. And Mr. Caldwell's beard? I could hear the difference in how his voice resonates, slightly muffled by facial hair. Sound tells me everything I need to know." The explanation was perfectly rational and demonstrated Ruth's extraordinary compensatory abilities. But it was also deeply unsettling, creating an impression that she possessed some supernatural perception beyond normal human senses. Ashford's guests departed earlier than planned, making polite excuses while clearly disturbed by the blind woman who seemed to see through methods they couldn't understand. After they left, Ashford confronted Ruth in the kitchen, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and fear. "What are you trying to do? Frighten away everyone who might still associate with this household? Make them think you're some kind of witch who can see despite being blind?" Ruth turned toward him with that uncanny accuracy that always seemed to put her scarred eyes directly on his face. "I was simply making conversation, husband, trying to be a gracious hostess as a wife should be. Is it my fault if people are unsettled by abilities they don't understand?" "You did it deliberately," Ashford insisted. "You wanted to frighten them. You wanted to make them uncomfortable." "Perhaps," Ruth admitted, and there was steel in her voice now. "Or perhaps I wanted them to understand that blindness doesn't mean powerlessness, that a woman without sight can still perceive truth that sighted people deliberately overlook, that disability and helplessness are not synonymous, no matter how much you might wish they were." It was the most direct confrontation they had had since the wedding, the first time Ruth had dropped her mask of subservient gratitude and revealed the intelligence and will that had been operating behind her disability all along. Ashford stared at her, seeing clearly for the first time that he had not married a helpless blind woman, but something far more dangerous, a mind that had spent 13 years in darkness learning to weaponize every disadvantage it had been given. "I should never have married you," he whispered. "No," Ruth agreed. "You should never have bought me. You should never have separated me from my children. You should never have treated me as property whose suffering was irrelevant to your comfort and profit. But you did all those things, Cornelius, and now we both live with the consequences." By the end of March, barely 3 weeks into their marriage, Ashford was showing the first subtle signs of the dual assault Ruth was conducting against his body and mind. He complained of occasional stomach discomfort and seemed more irritable than usual. Most tellingly, he had begun to exhibit slight paranoid tendencies, questioning whether household staff were moving his belongings or whether he was becoming forgetful and confused. But it was in early April that Ruth's campaign took an unexpected turn, not because of anything she had planned, but because of an intervention she hadn't anticipated. Dr. Hamilton Warren arrived at Harmony Hall unannounced one afternoon, requesting a private conversation with Ruth. The physician's visit surprised her. She had assumed that any medical consultations would involve Ashford directly, not his blind wife. But Warren had other concerns. They met in the small parlor that Ruth had claimed as her personal sitting room, and Warren's voice carried a gravity that immediately put Ruth on alert. "Mrs. Ashford, I'm going to speak to you with a directness that might seem inappropriate, but which I believe is necessary given the circumstances. I've been your husband's physician for over a decade. I know his constitution, his habits, and his general health better than perhaps anyone else in this county." Ruth waited silently, her face composed, but her mind racing through possibilities of what Warren might have discovered. "Your husband is declining," Warren continued. "His weight loss, his digestive complaints, his growing anxiety and paranoia, these are not normal stress responses. They suggest something more serious. And the timing of this decline, beginning so precisely with your marriage, has not escaped my notice." Ruth's heart accelerated, but her voice remained calm. "Are you suggesting that I'm somehow responsible for my husband's illness, Dr. Warren? That seems an extraordinary accusation to make against a blind woman who can barely navigate her own house without assistance." "I'm not making an accusation," Warren said carefully. "I'm expressing a concern based on medical observation. There are substances, poisons if you will, that can produce exactly the symptoms your husband is experiencing. Arsenic, for example, when administered in small doses over time, creates digestive problems, weakness, and neurological symptoms that mimic various natural diseases." The directness of his words stunned Ruth. She had not expected a country physician in 1851 to possess sophisticated knowledge of chronic poisoning, or to be perceptive enough to suspect the truth based solely on symptom patterns. She had underestimated Hamilton Warren, and that miscalculation could destroy everything. "Dr. Warren," Ruth said slowly, choosing her words with extreme care, "I understand that my marriage to Mr. Ashford seems unusual and perhaps suspicious. I understand that a blind former slave who suddenly becomes the legal wife of a declining plantation owner might appear to have sinister motives. But I assure you that I have nothing but my husband's best interests at heart." "I want to believe that," Warren replied. "Truly I do. But I also took an oath to protect my patients from harm, regardless of the source. So I'm going to ask you directly, Mrs. Ashford, are you poisoning your husband?" The silence that followed was profound. Ruth could hear Warren's breathing, could sense the tension in his posture, could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on both of them. She had two choices: deny everything and hope Warren had no proof, or take a calculated risk that could either destroy her plan or secure an unexpected ally. She chose the risk. "Dr. Warren, may I tell you a story?" Ruth asked. "A true story about a 19-year-old girl who had perfect vision and 3 beautiful children. A girl who made a minor mistake in a kitchen and had lye water thrown in her face by a man who valued his pride more than her sight. A girl who spent 13 years in darkness, separated from her children, treated as property by men who never once considered that she might be a human being with intelligence, memory, and the capacity for long-term planning." Warren said nothing, but Ruth could hear subtle changes in his breathing that suggested he was listening carefully. "That girl learned to navigate a world without sight," Ruth continued. "She learned to hear conversations through walls, to read people's intentions through their voices, to remember every detail of information that might someday prove useful. And over 13 years, she built a network of contacts, gathered evidence of crimes, and engineered a situation where the man who had separated her from her children would be forced to marry her, giving her legal status and proximity to destroy him the way he had destroyed her." "So you are poisoning him," Warren said quietly. "I'm executing him," Ruth corrected. "Slowly, carefully, and with the same methodical precision he showed when he decided my family was worth less than the cost of purchasing them together. This isn't murder, Dr. Warren. It's justice delayed by 13 years of necessary patience." Warren was silent for a long moment.
When he finally spoke, his voice carried a complexity of emotion that Ruth hadn't expected. "What you're describing is still murder under the law, Mrs. Ashford. Regardless of your justifications or his past cruelties, you're deliberately taking a human life through premeditated poisoning. I should report this to the authorities immediately." "You could," Ruth agreed, "and no court would believe the testimony of a blind black woman against the word of a respected white physician. They would arrest me, possibly execute me, and Ashford would survive to purchase another cook, separate another family, inflict suffering on other people who have no legal recourse against his cruelty. Your medical ethics would be satisfied, but justice would not be served." "Justice," Warren repeated, as if testing the word. "Is that really what this is? Or is it just revenge dressed in nobler language?" "Does the distinction matter?" Ruth asked. "If a legal system refuses to recognize certain people as fully human, if courts treat some lives as property rather than persons, if justice is available only to those with white skin and social status, then what option exists except the justice we create for ourselves?" Warren stood and walked to the window, his footsteps telling Ruth that he was deeply troubled by the moral complexity of the situation. When he finally spoke again, his voice was heavy with resignation and something that might have been reluctant admiration. "I'm not going to report this conversation," he said, "but I am going to continue treating your husband to the best of my abilities, trying to slow the decline you're engineering, and when he dies, because I can see now that his death is inevitable, I will sign a death certificate citing natural causes, not because I approve of what you're doing, but because I recognize that you're right about one fundamental thing. No legal system will ever hold Cornelius Ashford accountable for the crimes he committed against you and your children." "Thank you, Dr. Warren," Ruth said softly. "Don't thank me," Warren replied, his voice bitter. "I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because I'm tired of living in a society where people like Ashford can destroy lives with impunity while hiding behind laws that were designed to protect exactly their kind of cruelty. Your method is wrong, but your grievance is just, and I'm too morally compromised myself to stand in judgment of how you've chosen to address it." After Warren departed, Ruth sat alone in her parlor, processing the unexpected conversation. She had gained a reluctant ally, or at least a witness who had chosen not to intervene, but she had also revealed the truth about her plans to someone who could still destroy everything if he changed his mind. It was a dangerous development, but also one that suggested her revenge was generating moral complications that extended beyond her personal grievance against Ashford. The question Jacob Chen had posed in his note returned to haunt her. Was this justice or merely revenge? And Warren's variation, does the distinction even matter? Ruth had no answers that satisfied her conscience. She only knew that she had committed to this path, that turning back now would leave her children unavenged and her own suffering without meaning, and that whatever moral price she would pay for Ashford's death was a cost she had already accepted. She returned to the kitchen and prepared Ashford's evening coffee with its carefully measured dose of arsenic.
The poison would continue its work, regardless of philosophical debates about justice and revenge. And Cornelius Ashford would die, his death serving as a testament to the simple truth that even the powerless can destroy the powerful, given enough time, patience, and willingness to sacrifice their own humanity in pursuit of retribution. By early May 1851, Ashford's condition had deteriorated noticeably. His weight loss was becoming visible, his complexion had taken on a grayish pallor, and his hands exhibited a tremor that interfered with writing. More significantly, his psychological state had deteriorated even faster than his physical health. He was anxious, paranoid, sleeping poorly, and increasingly convinced that something terrible was happening to him that he couldn't understand or control. But Ruth had also refined her approach based on Warren's intervention. She realized that crude poisoning alone wouldn't achieve the complete psychological destruction she sought. She needed Ashford not just to die, but to die in absolute terror, experiencing in his final months the same helplessness and vulnerability she had endured for 13 years. To achieve this level of psychological devastation, Ruth decided to exploit Ashford's deepest fear, a fear she had identified years earlier through careful observation: his terror of blindness. The campaign began with subtle changes to lighting in Ashford's most frequently used spaces. Ruth gradually reduced the number of candles and lamps lit in the evening, creating slightly dimmer conditions that Ashford initially attributed to servant carelessness. But as the reduction continued, night after night, he began to notice that rooms seemed darker than they should be, that he was having difficulty reading by lamplight, that shadows seemed deeper and more oppressive. Simultaneously, Ruth began adding small amounts of belladonna, deadly nightshade, to Ashford's evening whiskey. Belladonna contains atropine, which causes pupil dilation and temporary vision disturbances. In tiny doses, it produces subtle effects: slight blurring, difficulty focusing, increased light sensitivity. These symptoms typically last only a few hours and are easily attributed to fatigue or too much alcohol. But combined with reduced lighting and Ashford's pre-existing anxiety about blindness, these temporary vision problems took on terrifying significance. The transformation happened faster than Ruth had anticipated. By mid-May, Ashford was experiencing regular episodes of vision disturbance, blurring, spots before his eyes, moments when darkness seemed to close in from the periphery of his visual field. He began obsessing about his eyesight, checking his vision constantly, asking other people if lighting seemed adequate or if it was just his imagination. One evening in late May, Ruth found him sitting in his study with his head in his hands, surrounded by candles he had lit in desperate attempt to create enough light to read by. His breathing was rapid and shallow, and even from across the room she could sense his terror. "Cornelius?" she said gently, using his first name as she had begun to do in recent weeks. "What's wrong?" "My eyes," he whispered. "Something's happening to my eyes. The text keeps blurring. I can't focus properly. Everything seems darker than it should be. What if I'm going blind like you?" Ruth moved closer, navigating the familiar space with perfect confidence despite her own sightlessness. She sat beside him and took his trembling hand in hers, a gesture of comfort
that made her skin crawl, but which her plan required. "Tell me what you see," she said softly. "Darkness," Ashford replied, his voice breaking. "Shadows everywhere, text that won't stay clear, spots and blurs that move across my vision. And I'm terrified, Ruth. I'm absolutely terrified of ending up like you, trapped in permanent darkness, helpless and dependent." For a moment, just a brief, flickering moment, Ruth felt something unexpected. Pity for the man whose terror she had so carefully engineered. She saw not the cruel plantation owner who had separated her from her children, but a frightened human being confronting the loss of something he had always taken for granted. Then she remembered her daughter's voice crying, "Mama, Mama!" and the pity vanished. "Blindness is terrifying," Ruth agreed, her voice carrying both compassion and something colder. "The initial darkness feels like drowning, like being buried alive in a tomb you can never escape. You panic, you rage, you bargain with God for just one more glimpse of light. And then, slowly, you realize that the darkness isn't going to end, that this is your reality now, and you either adapt or you die." "I can't live like that," Ashford said desperately. "I won't live like that. I'd rather die than be blind." "Many people feel that way," Ruth said, echoing the words she had spoken before, "until it happens to them. Then they discover that the human capacity for survival exceeds what they imagined possible. We can endure almost anything, Cornelius, even conditions we once thought were worse than death." But even as she offered this cold comfort, Ruth was already planning the final escalation of her campaign, the moment when Ashford's fear of blindness would combine with the accumulated poison in his system to create a psychological and physical crisis that would destroy him completely. That moment came on a humid night in mid-June, when Ruth decided it was time for Ashford to experience what she had experienced 13 years earlier, the absolute terror of vision destroyed by chemical burning. The setup required careful preparation. Ruth had obtained a small quantity of diluted lye solution, not concentrated enough to cause permanent damage, but sufficient to create burning sensation and temporary vision problems. She also prepared a special dose of laudanum mixed with an increased quantity of belladonna, creating a combination that would produce hallucinations and severe pupil dilation. On the evening of June 15, 1851, Ruth prepared Ashford's customary nighttime whiskey with the enhanced drug mixture. She brought it to his study, where he sat attempting to read by the light of a dozen candles he had insisted the household staff light for him. "Your evening whiskey, husband," she said, placing the glass on his desk with the gentle care of a devoted wife. "I added a bit of honey and some herbs that Dr. Warren suggested might help you sleep better. You've been so anxious lately." Ashford accepted the drink without question. He had long since stopped suspecting that Ruth might be the source of his problems. How could a blind woman possibly be orchestrating the complex deterioration he was experiencing? He drank the whiskey quickly, desperate for the temporary relief from anxiety that alcohol provided. Within 30 minutes, the drugs began to take effect. Ashford's pupils dilated dramatically, making the candlelight painfully bright, while simultaneously reducing his ability to see in normal lighting. His vision began to blur and distort, creating hallucinations at the edges of his visual field. Shadows that seemed to move, faces that appeared and vanished, darkness creeping in from all sides. Ruth waited in the hallway outside his study, listening to his breathing change, hearing the small sounds that indicated the drugs were working. When she judged the moment was right, she entered the room, carrying a small cloth saturated with the diluted lye solution. "Cornelius," she called softly, "are you all right? I heard strange sounds." "Ruth?" His voice was confused, frightened. "Something's wrong. Everything looks strange. The shadows are moving and I can't see properly." "Let me help you," Ruth said, moving closer with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was, despite her blindness. "Here, let me wipe your face. You're sweating." She reached out with the lye-soaked cloth, and in his drugged, confused state, Ashford didn't realize what was happening until she pressed the fabric directly against his closed eyes. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The diluted lye created a burning sensation that made Ashford scream and jerk backward, his hands flying to his eyes in exactly the same gesture Ruth had made 13 years earlier when concentrated lye had destroyed her vision. The burning wasn't severe enough to cause permanent damage. Ruth had calibrated the solution carefully, but it felt absolutely catastrophic to someone already convinced he was going blind. "My eyes!" Ashford screamed. "My eyes are burning! I can't see! Ruth, I can't see!" "I know," Ruth said softly, standing above him as he writhed in his chair, clawing at his face. "I know exactly what it feels like. The burning, the panic, the absolute terror of darkness closing in. This is what you did to me, Cornelius. This is what I felt when your business associate threw lye in my face because I had made a mistake in his kitchen. This is the justice you've avoided for 13 years. Through his drug-induced hallucinations and the burning pain in his eyes, Ashford's mind finally grasped the truth he had been too arrogant and privileged to see before. His blind cook wasn't a helpless victim. She was an instrument of calculated revenge, who had spent over a decade engineering his destruction with scientific precision. "You," he gasped, "you've been poisoning me all along." "Yes," Ruth confirmed, her voice carrying no triumph, only cold finality. "Every morning in your coffee. Arsenic, in doses carefully calculated to kill you slowly while mimicking natural illness. Dr. Warren suspects, but he won't intervene because he understands that you deserve what's happening to you. Your creditors forced this marriage because I arranged for them to discover your frauds. Your declining health, your vision problems, your psychological collapse, all of it has been my work, Cornelius. All of it has been justice delayed, but finally executed." Ashford tried to stand, tried to reach for her, but the combination of drugs and physical weakness from months of poisoning left him unable to do more than flail helplessly. He knocked over candles, sending them rolling across his desk. He swept books and papers to the floor in his blind panic. And through it all, Ruth stood calmly, listening to his terror with the same detached attention she had given to everything else in her carefully orchestrated revenge.
"The burning will fade in an hour or so," Ruth said. "Your vision will return, though it will be blurred for a day or two. But now you know what it feels like, Cornelius. Now you understand what you inflicted on me when you decided my sight was worth less than your convenience and your pride. And you'll spend every remaining day of your life, however few those days may be, knowing that I can do it again whenever I choose. That your vision, your health, your very life exists only because I permit it to continue." She left him there, thrashing in his study, surrounded by scattered candles and disturbed papers, experiencing the full weight of his helplessness and her power.
As she walked back to her room, Ruth felt not triumph, but a strange emptiness, as if the revenge she had pursued for 13 years was revealing itself to be less satisfying than she had imagined. Jacob Chen had been right. The poison was killing something in her, some capacity for mercy or compassion that might have survived her 13 years of suffering if she hadn't chosen this path. Dr. Warren had been right too. This was murder, regardless of how just her grievances might be. But it was too late to turn back now. Ashford knew the truth. He would either have to accept his fate or try to expose her, and Ruth had already prepared for both possibilities. If he remained silent, the poisoning would continue until his death in a few months. If he tried to accuse her, she had witnesses who would testify to his declining mental state, his paranoid delusions, and his growing instability. Either way, Cornelius Ashford was already dead. The only question remaining was how much he would suffer before his body finally caught up with that inevitable reality. The morning after the lye-cloth incident, Cornelius Ashford did not emerge from his locked bedroom. Ruth could hear him moving around inside, the creak of floorboards, occasional sounds of retching, the clink of a whiskey bottle against glass. But he made no attempt to come downstairs or call for assistance. The household staff exchanged nervous glances, uncertain whether to check on their master or respect his obvious desire for isolation. Ruth maintained her routine with mechanical precision, preparing breakfast that no one would eat, organizing the kitchen, and going through the motions of being a concerned wife whose husband had suffered some kind of episode the previous night. But internally, she was calculating the variables of her situation with cold, analytical precision. Ashford now knew the truth. He understood that his blind wife had been systematically poisoning him for months, that his declining health was not natural illness, but deliberate murder disguised as disease. The question was what he would do with that knowledge, and Ruth had prepared contingencies for every possibility. If Ashford tried to have her arrested, she had letters hidden with trusted contacts that would be delivered to authorities detailing his fraudulent business practices, complete with evidence that would destroy what remained of his reputation and likely result in criminal prosecution. If he attempted to have the marriage annulled, the same creditors who had forced the union would foreclose on Harmony Hall immediately, leaving him penniless and homeless. And if he tried to kill her directly, the most dangerous possibility, Ruth had arranged for her network to ensure that any accident befalling the blind Mrs. Ashford would trigger investigations that would expose everything. But there was a fourth possibility that Ruth hadn't fully anticipated.
that Ashford would simply break under the weight of his terror and knowledge, collapsing into complete psychological and physical deterioration without taking any action at all. That appeared to be what was happening. Dr. Hamilton Warren arrived at Harmony Hall on the afternoon of June 16th, summoned by a note from Ruth that read simply, "My husband has locked himself in his bedroom and will not respond to anyone. I fear he may be seriously ill. Please come immediately." Warren found Ruth waiting in the main parlor, her hands folded in her lap, her scarred face composed, but her posture suggesting genuine concern. When he entered, she turned toward him with that uncanny accuracy that always made it seem as though she could actually see him. "Thank you for coming so quickly, Dr. Warren," she said. "I'm very worried about Cornelius. He's been getting worse for weeks, but last night something happened that seemed to push him beyond what he could endure." "What happened?" Warren asked, his voice carefully neutral, despite knowing far more about the situation than Ruth realized he should. "I'm not entirely certain," Ruth replied, choosing her words with meticulous care. "He was in his study last evening, trying to read by candlelight, as he often does. I brought him his nighttime whiskey and left him alone. But later I heard him crying out, saying something about his eyes burning and not being able to see. By the time I got to the study, he was in terrible distress, knocking things over, seeming completely disoriented. I tried to help him to his bedroom, but he pushed me away and locked himself inside. He hasn't come out since." The account was technically accurate, while omitting the crucial detail that Ruth had deliberately caused the episode by applying diluted lye to Ashford's eyes. Warren listened carefully, hearing both what Ruth was saying and what she was deliberately not saying. "I'll need to examine him," Warren said. "Can you get him to unlock the door?" "I've tried," Ruth said. "He won't respond to my voice, but perhaps he'll listen to you." They made their way upstairs to Ashford's bedroom, where Warren knocked firmly on the locked door. "Mr. Ashford, it's Dr. Warren. Your wife is concerned about your health. I need to examine you. Please open the door." For a long moment there was only silence. Then Ashford's voice came through the heavy wood, weak and ragged. "Go away. I don't need a doctor. I just need to be left alone." "I can't do that," Warren replied. "If you don't open this door voluntarily, I'll have no choice but to assume you're in medical distress and break it down. You know I have the legal authority to do so if I believe a patient is in danger." Another silence, followed by the sound of furniture being moved. The lock clicked, and the door opened just wide enough for Warren to slip inside. He glanced back at Ruth, who remained in the hallway, then entered the room and closed the door behind him. What Warren found inside shocked him, despite his professional experience with illness and human suffering. Ashford was sitting on the edge of his bed, dressed in a nightshirt stained with sweat and vomit. His eyes were red and swollen, with visible irritation around the lids. His hands trembled uncontrollably, and his skin had taken on a grayish-yellow pallor that suggested advanced arsenic poisoning. But most disturbing was the expression on his face, absolute terror mixed with hopeless resignation, the look of a man who had finally understood that he was going to die, and there was nothing he could do to prevent it. "She's killing me,"
Ashford whispered as soon as the door was closed. "My wife, the blind woman. She's been poisoning me for months. Arsenic in my coffee every morning, and last night she burned my eyes with something, made me feel what she felt when her eyes were destroyed. She told me everything, Warren. She confessed the whole plan, and now I'm trapped, because if I expose her, she'll expose me, and I'll lose everything anyway." Warren sat down in a chair across from his patient, his expression grave. "I know," he said simply. Ashford's head snapped up, his bloodshot eyes widening. "You know? What do you mean, you know?" "Your wife told me several weeks ago," Warren explained. "She explained exactly what she was doing and why. And she was right that I wouldn't report it, because the legal system that should protect you is the same system that allowed you to purchase her, separate her from her children, and treat her as property whose suffering was irrelevant to your convenience." "So you're just going to let her murder me?" Ashford's voice rose with desperate anger. "You took an oath to protect patients, to preserve life. How can you stand by and watch her poison me to death?" "I'm not standing by," Warren said quietly. "I'm treating your symptoms to the best of my abilities, trying to slow the process she's initiated. But I'm not going to stop her, and I'm not going to expose her, because fundamentally I agree with her that you deserve what's happening to you." Ashford stared at him with an expression of utter betrayal. "I trusted you. For over a decade you've been my physician, and now you're siding with a blind slave who's committing murder?" "She's not a slave anymore," Warren corrected. "She's your legal wife, a free woman with rights that even you can't fully strip away despite your best efforts. And yes, I'm siding with her because I've spent too many years watching men like you destroy lives with impunity while hiding behind laws designed to protect exactly your kind of cruelty." Warren stood and moved to his medical bag, removing supplies for a physical examination. "Now let me look at your eyes and assess your current condition. Whether you accept it or not, I'm still your physician, and I will continue treating your symptoms even if I won't prevent their ultimate cause." The examination took 15 minutes and confirmed what Warren already suspected. Ashford was suffering from advanced chronic arsenic poisoning, combined with psychological trauma that was accelerating his physical decline. The eye irritation from the previous night's lye exposure was superficial and would heal, but it had pushed Ashford past some psychological breaking point from which he was unlikely to recover. "How long do I have?" Ashford asked when the examination was complete, his voice hollow with acceptance. Warren considered lying, offering false hope that might ease his patient's final months. But he decided that Ashford deserved the truth, however brutal it might be. 2 months, possibly 3 if you stop consuming the arsenic immediately. But that would require you to stop drinking coffee, stop accepting food prepared by your wife, essentially stop trusting anything in this household. And even if you managed that level of vigilance, the damage already done to your digestive system and nervous system is significant. You'll likely die from organ failure within 6 months, regardless of whether the poisoning continues. 6 months, Ashford repeated, and then, unexpectedly, he laughed. A bitter, broken sound that had nothing to do with humor. 6 months to live as a prisoner in my own house, terrified of every meal, every drink, knowing that the blind woman I was forced to marry is orchestrating my death with the precision of a chess master. There's a certain poetry to it, isn't there? The powerless slave becomes the all-powerful wife, and the master becomes the victim of his own cruelty. There is another option, Warren said carefully. You could leave. Abandon Harmony Hall. Flee to another state where your creditors can't reach you and your wife's network has no power. You'd lose everything, your property, your social status, your identity, but you'd survive. Ashford shook his head slowly. Where would I go? What would I do? I'm a Georgia plantation owner, dying of poison and terror. That's my entire identity. Without this property, without my social position, I'm nothing. And besides, he added with dark insight, she'd find me. That network you mentioned, the contacts she's built over 13 years, they'd track me down wherever I ran. The blind woman sees everything, Warren. She always has. I was just too arrogant and stupid to realize it until it was too late. After Dr. Warren departed, leaving behind medicines that would provide minimal relief from symptoms, but would do nothing to address their underlying cause, Ruth knocked softly on Ashford's still unlocked bedroom door.
"May I come in?" she asked, her voice carrying a gentleness that seemed genuine despite everything she had revealed the previous night. "Why bother asking permission?" Ashford replied bitterly. "You control everything in this house. You control whether I live or die. What difference does it make if you have my permission to enter a room?" Ruth entered anyway, navigating the familiar space with confident steps that took her directly to the chair Warren had recently vacated. She sat down and folded her hands in her lap, her scarred face turned toward Ashford with that disturbing accuracy that made it seem as though her blind eyes could still perceive him. "I've been thinking about what Jacob Chen wrote in his letter," Ruth said, surprising Ashford by mentioning something he knew nothing about. "He asked me whether this was justice or merely revenge, and whether the distinction even mattered. I didn't have a good answer then. I'm not sure I have one now." "You're a murderer," Ashford said flatly. "Whatever noble language you use to describe it, you're deliberately killing another human being through premeditated poisoning. That's not justice. That's just murder with a justification." "Perhaps," Ruth agreed. "But then what do you call what you did to me? You purchased me knowing I had 3 children, then deliberately chose not to buy them because keeping families together cost more than separating them. You condemned 3 children to grow up without their mother, and a mother to spend the rest of her life not knowing if her babies were alive or dead, safe or suffering. What's the legal term for that kind of cruelty?" "It was legal," Ashford said, but his voice lacked conviction. "The law allowed me to purchase you without purchasing your children. I didn't break any laws." "Exactly," Ruth said, and there was steel in her voice now. "The law protected your right to destroy my family. The law classified me as property rather than as a person.
The law gave you complete power over my life, while giving me no recourse against your cruelty. So when the law itself is unjust, when the legal system is designed to protect people like you and dehumanize people like me, what option exists except the justice we create for ourselves? So you poison me, Ashford said. You destroy me slowly and methodically, because the law won't punish me for what I did to you.
Yes, Ruth confirmed simply. That's exactly what I'm doing. And I'm not asking for your forgiveness or your understanding. I'm simply explaining why I made the choices I made, and why I'll continue making them until you're dead and I'm free to leave this place and try to find my children. The mention of her children seemed to deflate some of Ashford's anger, replacing it with something that might have been guilt or perhaps just exhausted resignation. You'll never find them, he said quietly. They were sold over a decade ago to different owners in different states. The records are fragmentary at best. Even if you spend the rest of your life searching, the chances of locating all three are essentially zero. I know, Ruth said, and for the first time since entering the room, genuine emotion colored her voice. I know the odds are impossible. I know that my daughter would be almost 24 now, my older son 22, my youngest son 19, all of them adults I wouldn't recognize and who probably don't remember me. But I have to try, Cornelius, even if it takes the rest of my life. Even if I never succeed, I have to try, because they're my children, and I'm their mother, and nothing, not slavery, not time, not the impossible odds, can change that fundamental truth. They sat in silence for several minutes, two people connected by marriage, but divided by an unbridgeable gulf of suffering and culpability. Finally, Ashford spoke again, his voice carrying a strange mixture of curiosity and resignation. How did you do it? How did a blind woman build a network powerful enough to destroy me, manipulate my creditors, and orchestrate this entire elaborate revenge? I need to understand that before I die. Ruth considered refusing to answer, but something in Ashford's tone suggested that he was asking not to find a way to fight back, but simply to understand the magnitude of what had defeated him. And in that moment, she decided to give him the truth. It started 3 years after you purchased me, Ruth began. I was cleaning your study one afternoon when you and a business associate were discussing a fraudulent cotton scheme in the next room. You thought I was deaf as well as blind, or perhaps you simply didn't consider that a slave might understand and remember complex financial information. But I did understand, and I remembered every detail. I began listening more carefully after that, she continued, paying attention to conversations you had with visitors, business correspondence you discussed with your partners, financial documents you left on your desk, assuming a blind woman couldn't read them. But I could read, Cornelius. My mother taught me before you purchased me, and I taught myself to read by touch, using raised marks and tactile variations in paper that sighted people never notice.
Ashford listened with growing amazement as Ruth described the intelligence network she had built over 13 years. She explained how she had made contact with free black tradesmen who visited the plantation, gradually cultivating relationships based on shared information and mutual assistance. How she had connected with enslaved people from neighboring properties, creating a communication system that allowed messages to travel across Georgia faster than official mail service. How she had eventually made contact with abolitionist sympathizers who provided resources and connections that extended her reach throughout the South.
Every piece of information I gathered about your fraudulent business practices was carefully documented and stored with trusted contacts, Ruth explained. When the time was right, I arranged for that information to reach the people you had victimized, the Pattersons, the Caldwells, James Whitmore. They were already suspicious, already looking for evidence against you. I simply gave them what they needed to build an unassailable case. And the forced marriage? Ashford asked. How did you know they would demand that specifically, rather than just prosecuting me directly? I suggested it, Ruth said, and there was grim satisfaction in her voice. Through intermediaries, I planted the idea that forcing you to marry your blind cook would be a more devastating punishment than mere financial ruin or imprisonment, that it would destroy your social standing completely, while still allowing you to keep your property under supervision, that it would humiliate you in ways that legal prosecution never could. The idea appealed to them because it was creative and cruel and had a certain poetic justice. They had no idea that the blind woman you'd be forced to marry was actually the architect of their entire revenge scheme. Ashford shook his head in disbelief. 13 years. You spent 13 years planning this, building your network, gathering evidence, positioning pieces on a chessboard I didn't even know existed, all while pretending to be a helpless blind cook who accepted her enslaved status with Christian resignation. Exactly, Ruth confirmed, because that's what you needed to believe about me, that I was powerless, helpless, incapable of complex thought or long-term planning. Your own prejudices and assumptions became my greatest weapons. You never truly saw me, Cornelius. You saw a blind slave, not a thinking human being with intelligence, memory, and the capacity for systematic revenge. I see you now, Ashford said quietly. Too late to matter, but I see you. And I recognize that I'm not just dying from poison. I'm dying from my own blindness, my own refusal to acknowledge the humanity of someone I had reduced to property. The next 6 weeks passed with a strange intimacy between the dying man and the woman who was killing him. Ashford no longer tried to avoid Ruth or lock himself away from her presence. Instead, he seemed almost resigned to his fate, accepting her company and even seeking out their conversations with increasing frequency. Ruth continued administering arsenic, but she reduced the doses slightly, extending Ashford's life by a few weeks beyond what Dr. Warren had predicted. She told herself this was pragmatic. A slower death would attract less suspicion and give her more time to prepare for her departure from Georgia. But she also recognized that some part of her was finding unexpected value in these final conversations with a man she had every reason to hate. They talked about many things during those weeks. Ashford spoke about his childhood in Kentucky, his struggle to achieve social status
in Georgia's plantation aristocracy, the constant fear of financial ruin that had driven him to increasingly desperate and illegal schemes. Ruth shared stories about her own childhood, her children, and the gradual process of learning to navigate the world without sight. Most surprisingly, they talked about morality and justice, wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. Was Ruth's methodical revenge more or less ethical than Ashford's casual cruelty? Did the injustice of slavery justify extra-legal violence against slave owners? Could murder ever truly be justice, or was it always just revenge dressed in nobler language? Neither of them found satisfying answers, but the conversations seemed to matter anyway, as if two people on opposite sides of an unbridgeable moral divide could still find some fragment of shared humanity in the acknowledgement of complexity and doubt. Dr. Warren visited regularly, monitoring Ashford's decline and providing palliative care that eased symptoms without addressing their cause. He never directly acknowledged his knowledge of Ruth's poisoning campaign during these visits, maintaining professional detachment while privately marveling at the strange dynamic that had developed between murderer and victim. During one visit in late July, Warren found Ashford sitting in the garden with Ruth beside him, the dying man describing the colors of flowers that his blind wife couldn't see, while she held his trembling hand with surprising gentleness. "The roses are deep red this year," Ashford was saying, his voice weak but steady. "Almost crimson, darker than I've ever seen them, and the gardenias are blooming early, white flowers with yellow centers, the smell so strong it almost overwhelms everything else." Ruth listened carefully, her scarred face tilted toward Ashford, as if she could perceive the flowers through his descriptions. "Thank you," she said softly. "I remember colors from before. Sometimes I dream in color, even though I haven't seen anything in 13 years. Your descriptions help me remember what the world looked like when I could still see it." Warren watched this scene with complex emotions he couldn't fully name. These two people, murderer and victim, former slave and former master, blind woman and dying man, had somehow found a connection that transcended the terrible circumstances that had brought them together. It wasn't love, and it certainly wasn't forgiveness, but it was something more nuanced than simple hatred or revenge. After the examination, Warren took Ruth aside for a private conversation in the kitchen. "He's deteriorating faster now," the physician said quietly. "The arsenic accumulation has reached levels that are causing multiple organ failures. His kidneys are barely functioning, his liver is damaged, and his nervous system is severely compromised. I'd estimate he has 2 weeks at most, possibly less." "I know," Ruth said. "I can hear it in his breathing, in the way he moves. His body is shutting down." "Are you going to stop?" Warren asked. "Now that death is inevitable, are you going to ease off the poison and let him die without additional suffering?" Ruth was silent for a long moment, considering the question seriously. "No," she finally said. "I'm going to continue the doses exactly as I've been administering them. Not because I need to ensure his death. That's guaranteed now, regardless of what I do. But because stopping would suggest mercy or forgiveness, and I have neither of those things to offer him. He's dying from the consequences of his own cruelty, and I won't soften those consequences just because he's become more human to me in his final weeks."
"That's cold," Warren observed. "Yes," Ruth agreed, "it is. But then, so was separating a mother from her 3 children, because buying them together cost more than buying them separately. Coldness isn't unique to me or my revenge, Dr. Warren. It's a fundamental characteristic of the system we all live within. I'm just redirecting it towards someone who has spent his life inflicting it on others." Warren had no response to that. He finished his medical documentation and departed, leaving Ruth to continue her work of systematic murder disguised as devoted care. Cornelius Ashford died on August 3, 1851, 4 months and 1 day after his forced marriage to the blind woman who had destroyed him with patient precision. The final day of his life was both terrible and strangely peaceful, as if he had finally accepted that death was not just inevitable, but perhaps even deserved. He woke that morning unable to leave his bed, his body too weak to support even basic movement. Ruth heard his labored breathing from her adjacent room and knew that the end had finally arrived. She went to him, sitting beside his bed and taking his hand in hers, a gesture that had become familiar during their final weeks together. "It's today, isn't it?" Ashford whispered, his voice barely audible. "I can feel it. My body is finished." "Yes," Ruth confirmed. "Today you'll die, and I'll be free." "Free to search for your children," Ashford said. "Free to try to rebuild something from the ruins of what slavery destroyed." "Yes." They sat in silence for several minutes, Ashford's breathing becoming more labored and irregular. Then, with obvious effort, he spoke again. "Ruth, I need to tell you something about your children. It's the last thing I can give you, the only thing I have left that might matter." Ruth's hand tightened on his, her entire body tensing with sudden, desperate hope. "You know where they are?" "I kept records," Ashford said, each word requiring tremendous effort. "Hidden in my study, behind the panel in the east wall. Bills of sale, names of purchasers, locations, for all 3 of your children. I told you I didn't know, but I lied. I've always known exactly where they went." Tears began flowing down Ruth's scarred cheeks, the first tears she had allowed herself in 13 years. "Why? Why are you telling me this now?" "Because it's the only way I can acknowledge what I did to you," Ashford whispered. "The only way I can admit that I destroyed something precious and irreplaceable for no reason except that it was legally permitted and economically convenient. I can't undo what I did, but I can at least give you the chance to try to find them, to maybe rebuild what I broke." "Thank you," Ruth said, and the words carried genuine gratitude mixed with the complex hatred she had nurtured for over a decade. "Thank you for this gift, even if it comes 13 years too late and costs you nothing because you're dying anyway." "I'm sorry," Ashford said, and it was impossible to tell if he meant it or if these were just words a dying man said because he thought he should. "For what I did to you, for what I did to your family, for all of it, I'm sorry." Ruth didn't respond.
She couldn't bring herself to offer forgiveness for crimes that had shaped 13 years of her life and might echo through generations of her family. But she continued holding his hand as his breathing became more irregular, as his body began the final process of shutting down. Ashford's final words, spoken so softly that Ruth had to lean close to hear them, were, "The darkness. It's not as terrible as I imagined. Almost peaceful." And then he was gone, his hand going limp in Ruth's grasp, his labored breathing ceasing entirely. Ruth sat with his body for several more minutes, processing the reality that her 13-year quest for revenge had finally reached completion. Cornelius Ashford was dead. She was free. And hidden somewhere in his study were records that might allow her to find her children. She stood, released his hand, and walked to the bedroom door, where she called for Dr. Warren, who had been waiting in a downstairs room for exactly this summons. Warren came quickly, examined the body, and after a brief assessment, pronounced Cornelius Ashford dead of natural causes related to chronic digestive illness and nervous exhaustion. The death certificate Warren prepared made no mention of arsenic poisoning, chemical burns, or psychological torture. It was a simple document recording that a 46-year-old plantation owner had succumbed to health problems that had plagued him for months. Anyone reading the certificate would see only a tragic but unremarkable death, not the culmination of one of the most elaborate revenge schemes in American history. The funeral was held 3 days later, attended by a handful of neighbors who had maintained minimal contact with Harmony Hall despite the scandalous circumstances of Ashford's marriage. Ruth played her role as grieving widow with convincing sincerity, accepting condolences and thanks from people who assumed she had cared for her dying husband with devoted attention during his final months. What none of them knew was that Ruth had already packed her belongings, secured the hidden records about her children's whereabouts, and made arrangements through her network for transportation to Canada. As Ashford's legal widow, she inherited nothing. Georgia law prohibited former slaves from inheriting property from their former owners, even if those owners had been their legal husbands. But Ruth had never expected or wanted Ashford's property. She had wanted only his death and the information he had finally provided about her children. 1 week after the funeral, Ruth disappeared from Harmony Hall in the middle of the night, guided by contacts from her network who provided safe passage northward. She took with her only what she could carry: some clothing, a small amount of money she had saved, and most importantly, the documents from Ashford's hidden panel that listed the names and last known locations of her 3 children. The household staff woke the next morning to find the blind mistress gone without explanation or forwarding address. Some assumed she had fled to avoid questions about her husband's death. Others suspected she had been helped by the same abolitionist network that had arranged other escapes from Georgia plantations. A few, the ones who had known her longest and understood her capabilities best, suspected that her entire marriage and her husband's subsequent death had been part of some larger plan that was now reaching completion. Dr. Hamilton Warren, when he learned of Ruth's departure, felt only relief mixed with reluctant admiration. He had witnessed something remarkable. A powerless, blind woman had destroyed a powerful plantation owner using nothing but patience, intelligence, and willingness to sacrifice her own moral purity in pursuit of justice. Whether that made her a hero or a villain, Warren couldn't decide, Perhaps she was both, or perhaps those categories were simply inadequate for describing what she had accomplished. Epilogue, 20 years later. In 1871, 2 decades after Cornelius Ashford's death, a small notice appeared in a Canadian newspaper's community section. It announced the opening of a new school for blind children in Toronto, founded by a woman named Ruth Morrison, who had dedicated her life to teaching people without sight how to navigate the world with confidence and independence. The notice mentioned that Mrs. Morrison had been blinded by a chemical accident in her youth and had spent many years searching for her children, who had been separated from her during the difficult period before the American Civil War. Through persistence and luck, she had eventually located all 3, her daughter working as a teacher in Philadelphia, her older son farming in Ohio, and her youngest son serving as a minister in a black church in Boston. The reunion had been emotional and complicated. Her children barely remembered her, having been so young when they were separated. The relationships they rebuilt were fragile and imperfect, shaped by decades of absence and the different lives they had all lived. But they were relationships nonetheless, connections that had survived slavery, time, and impossible odds. The notice also mentioned that Mrs. Morrison's school was funded partly through a mysterious bequest from an unnamed Georgia benefactor whose estate had been settled years after his death. No one in Toronto knew the full story behind this funding, and Ruth never explained it. But those who worked closely with her sometimes noticed that she kept a small memorial in her private office, a marriage certificate from 1851 and a death certificate from the same year, documents that seemed to hold some significance she never fully articulated. When students asked Mrs. Morrison how she had survived her years of blindness and hardship with such strength, she would always give the same answer. Darkness teaches you things that sight obscures. It teaches patience, careful planning, and the importance of listening to what people reveal when they think you can't perceive them. Most importantly, it teaches that powerlessness is often an illusion, that even the most vulnerable among us possess strengths that the powerful fail to recognize until it's too late. No one understood the full meaning of her words, and Ruth never elaborated. The story of how a blind cook had methodically destroyed her owner through 4 months of systematic poisoning and psychological torture remained known only to a handful of people, most of whom had died by 1871. Dr. Hamilton Warren, who lived until 1879, never spoke publicly about what he had witnessed at Harmony Hall, but in his private journals, discovered after his death, he had written extensively about the moral complexities of Ruth's revenge and his own complicity in allowing it to proceed. His final entry on the subject, dated 1876, read, "I have spent 25 years wrestling with the question of whether I should have stopped Ruth from poisoning Cornelius Ashford. The easy answer is yes. I was a physician, sworn to protect life regardless of circumstances. But the honest answer is more complex. I allowed her to continue because I recognized that she was executing a justice that no legal system would provide, punishing crimes that no court would acknowledge. Was that right? I still don't know. But I know that I witnessed something remarkable. A powerless woman teaching a powerful man that blindness and sight are not the same as weakness and strength, and that justice delayed is not the same as justice denied." Ruth herself never wrote about what she had done or attempted to justify her actions to anyone. She simply continued her work, teaching blind children to navigate a world designed for the sighted, building a legacy that helped hundreds of people live fuller lives than they might have imagined possible. When she died in 1889, at the age of 71, her funeral was attended by dozens of former students, 3 adult children who had learned to love the mother they barely remembered, and a community that recognized her as a pioneer in education for the blind. The eulogy praised her patience, her intelligence, and her unwavering commitment to helping the powerless find strength in their circumstances. No one mentioned that she had once committed the perfect murder, using the very disability that society viewed as her greatest weakness as her most effective weapon against a man who had treated her as property rather than as a person. The marriage certificate and death certificate remained in her effects, carefully preserved between sheets of acid-free paper. When her daughter discovered them while sorting through Ruth's belongings, she asked the obvious question, "Mother, why did you keep these documents all these years? What did they mean to you?" Ruth's daughter never received an answer, because her mother had died the previous week. But if Ruth had been able to respond, she might have said something like this: "I kept them as a reminder that justice is complicated, that revenge and righteousness are not easily separated, and that sometimes the only way to reclaim your humanity is to sacrifice your innocence. Those documents represent both the worst thing I ever did and the most necessary thing I ever did. They are proof that I was both victim and perpetrator, both powerless and all-powerful, both blind and more perceptive than anyone around me realized. Most importantly, they remind me that darkness, whether physical or moral, is not the absence of everything, but a different way of perceiving truth that light sometimes obscures." The certificate still exists today in a Toronto archive, a fragile piece of paper that records a marriage between Cornelius Ashford and blind Ruth, property of said household. Archivists who catalog it note only that it represents an unusual case of a plantation owner marrying an enslaved woman in 1851 Georgia, without understanding the full story behind that union or its terrible conclusion. The truth remains hidden in darkness, perceived only by those patient enough to listen for whispers of a justice that operated outside the law, executed by a blind woman who understood that sometimes the powerless must create their own retribution when the powerful control all legal avenues of accountability. And in that darkness, if you listen carefully, you might hear the echo of Ruth Morrison's voice, speaking words she never said aloud, but which defined her entire life. "You blinded me, separated me from my children, and treated me as property rather than as a person. So I taught you what it meant to be truly blind, to your own cruelty, to your own vulnerability, and finally, to the reality that justice belongs not to those who write the laws, but to those who survive long enough to execute it themselves."